In the early 1940s, the world was locked in a war of iron and logic. On both sides of the conflict, the brightest minds of a generation were obsessed with a single goal: building the perfect machine. They built rotors of brass and copper, complex gears that could scramble a message into a billion combinations. They believed that the future of intelligence lay in ciphers, mathematical puzzles so dense that only another machine could solve them. The Germans had the Enigma. The Japanese had the Purple Code. The Americans had the Sigaba. These were the titans of cryptography, mechanical brains designed to keep secrets in the age of global radio. But as the war reached its most desperate chapters, one of the most secure intelligence systems in human history emerged. It didn't rely on a keyboard. It didn't use electricity. It didn't have a single moving part. It was spoken. It was a system that baffled the most sophisticated listening stations in Tokyo and Berlin. While enemy cryptanalysts sat with headphones clamped to their ears, trying to find a pattern in the rhythmic clicks and hums of electronic encryption, they instead heard something that sounded like wind moving through a canyon. They heard a language that defied every rule of Indo-European grammar, a code that was not built by engineers, but whispered by a group of men whose culture the world had nearly forgotten. By the spring of 1942, the Allied war effort in the Pacific was bleeding. The Japanese Imperial Navy was moving with a speed and precision that suggested they knew the Americans' next move before the Americans did. And in many cases, they did. Standard military encryption was failing. The problem was time. Even a strong code often took hours to encrypt and hours to decrypt on the other end. In the heat of an amphibious assault on a Pacific island, hours were an eternity. By the time a commander could transmit an order to adjust artillery fire, the target had moved, or the radio operator had been killed. Moreover, Japanese cryptanalysts, many of whom had been educated in the United States, were breaking Allied field codes with terrifying efficiency. They were masters of pattern recognition. They understood the frequency of certain letters and the predictable structure of military jargon. Messages were intercepted at dawn, and by noon, Japanese ambushes were set. Operations were compromised, and thousands of young Marines were losing their lives before they even stepped off the landing craft. The U.S. military needed something radical. They didn't need a faster machine. They needed a different kind of human. They needed a code that was so fast it could be spoken in real time, and so complex that no amount of mathematical brute force could ever crack it. The answer came from Philip Johnston, a veteran of World War I and the son of a missionary. Johnston had grown up on the Navajo reservation, and he knew a secret that the Department of War had never considered. The Navajo language, Diné Bizad, was unlike anything spoken in Europe or Asia. It was a linguistic fortress. At the time of the war, there was no written form. There were no dictionaries, no grammars, and no scholarly texts for a foreign spy to steal. It was a tonal language with a syntax so convoluted that it felt like a three-dimensional puzzle. The language featured extreme complexity. A single verb could have thousands of variations depending on the speaker's intent, the shape of the object being discussed, and the relationship between the two. Unfamiliar sounds. It utilized glottal stops and nasalized vowels that non-native speakers found nearly impossible to distinguish, let alone replicate. Linguistic isolation. It belonged to the Athabascan family, completely unrelated to the Romantic or Germanic languages studied by the Axis powers. Linguists of the era considered it nearly impossible for an adult to learn from scratch. To the German and Japanese intelligence, the Navajo language didn't even exist as a target. They had spent decades studying English, Spanish, German, and French. They were prepared for a war of math. They were not prepared for a war of breath. By the spring of 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps recruited 29 Navajo men to attend boot camp at Camp Pendleton. These men were not just soldiers, they were the architects of a new reality. Their task was to take their ancient language and turn it into a weapon of war. They were given a room and told to create a code. They knew that simply speaking Navajo wasn't enough. They had to create a cipher within the language to handle modern military terminology. How do you say fighter plane or tank or submarine in a language that evolved in the high desert of the American Southwest? They developed a two-tiered system. Direct substitution. They chose Navajo words that shared a characteristic with the military term. A tank became a chaidagahi, a tortoise. A fighter plane became a dahetihi, a hummingbird. A submarine became a bishlo, an iron fish. The alphabet. For words that had no substitute, they created a phonetic alphabet. To spell out a location, they would use Navajo words for common objects where the English translations started with the desired letter. To send the letter A, they might say wolachi, an ant. To send B, they would say shush, a bear. When the first 29 finished their work, they had created a code that could translate 3 lines of English to Navajo and back again in under 20 seconds. The same message processed by a mechanical cipher machine took 30 minutes. The Navajo code talkers were deployed to every major marine operation in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. But it was on the black sands of Iwo Jima that the code proved its true worth. During the first 48 hours of the invasion, 6 Navajo code talkers worked around the clock. They were positioned in the thick of the fighting, often with nothing but a radio and a pencil as Japanese mortars rained down around them. In that 2-day period alone, they transmitted over 800 messages without a single error. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signals officer, later remarked, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The Japanese were baffled. Their monitors were picking up the transmissions, but they couldn't even identify what they were hearing. It didn't sound like code. It sounded like wind moving through a canyon. They heard a language that defied every rule of Indo-European grammar, a code that was not built by engineers, but whispered by a group of men whose culture the world had nearly forgotten. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the Navajo code talker's story is what happened after the war ended. When the soldiers returned home, they didn't receive parades. They didn't receive medals for their specific intelligence work. In fact, they were told they could never speak of what they had done. The U.S. military realized that the Navajo code was so successful and so fundamentally unbreakable that they wanted to keep it in reserve for future conflicts. The code talkers were sworn to secrecy. For 23 years, they lived in their communities, working as ranchers, teachers, and laborers, never telling their wives or children that they had carried the most vital secrets of the Pacific War in their heads. It wasn't until 1968, when the program was finally declassified, that the world learned why the Japanese could never find the American machines. They hadn't been fighting a machine, they had been fighting a culture. The code that defeated the Axis wasn't built in a lab, it was a living language, a piece of American heritage that had been used to save the world. The 29 Navajo recruits who arrived at Camp Pendleton in 1942 were handed a task that seemed fundamentally impossible. They weren't just asked to use their native tongue, they were asked to re-engineer it. The Navajo language, Diné Bizad, was an ancient, poetic instrument born of the high desert and the spiritual traditions of the Southwest. It was a language of nature, of livestock, of seasons, and of sacred geography. It was never intended to describe the industrial slaughter of the 20th century. The Marines didn't just need a secret language, they needed a tactical one. In a small, sweltering room on the base, the first 29 began the work of linguistic transmutation. They realized early on that literal translations were too slow and often lacked the necessary precision. To achieve the lightning-fast communication required on a chaotic battlefield, they had to create a new secondary vocabulary, a code within the code. For specialized terms, they developed a phonetic alphabet using Navajo words for common animals and objects. To spell out a location or a specific name, they would use a chain of Navajo words whose English translations began with the required letter. To send the letter A, they used Woolachi, ant. For B, they used Shush, bear. This meant that even if a listener knew the Navajo language, a string of words like ant, bear, cat would sound like a nonsensical list of animals rather than a coordinate. The result was a miracle of efficiency. In a test conducted at Camp Pendleton, a Navy cipher machine, the pinnacle of mathematical encryption, took 30 minutes to encode and transmit a 3-line message. The Navajo code talkers did it in 20 seconds. They weren't just more secure, they were faster than the machines. By 1943, Japanese intelligence officers were growing desperate. Their signals intelligence units were some of the best in the world. They had successfully broken various American field codes and were routinely intercepting radio traffic from the Pacific Front. But they were encountering a new, impenetrable wall of sound. Day and night, Japanese monitors in Tokyo and across the occupied islands recorded the transmissions. They were high-fidelity recordings of men speaking with a distinct rhythmic cadence. The cryptanalysts passed the tapes to their most elite experts, men who had been educated at Harvard and Oxford, men who were fluent in every major European and Asian dialect, and they failed completely. The Navajo language is tonal and glottal. The meaning of a word changes based on the pitch of the speaker's voice. To a Japanese ear trained in the predictable structures of English or German, the Navajo transmissions didn't sound like a code or a cipher. They sounded like a throaty gargling noise, perhaps a primitive dialect or a deliberate attempt at audio distortion. They tried to find patterns. They looked for the frequency of vowel clusters. They looked for repetitions that might indicate a letter substitution system. But because the Navajo language is a verb-based language where a single word can contain an entire sentence's worth of information, the mathematical tools of Western cryptanalysis were useless. The Japanese intelligence files piled up in massive, useless stacks. They had the sounds, they had the recordings, and they had the physical transmissions, but they lacked the cultural key. They were trying to solve a spiritual and linguistic puzzle with a slide rule. The ultimate test of the Navajo code talkers came on a sulfurous black sand island in the Pacific, Iwo Jima. The invasion was a nightmare of vertical combat. The Japanese had transformed the island into a subterranean fortress, and the Marines were dying in thousands just to move 10 yards inland. In the first 48 hours of the assault, the communication lines were the only thing keeping the invasion from collapsing into total chaos. 6 Navajo code talkers, working in shifts under constant mortar and sniper fire, became the nervous system of the 5th Marine Division. They transmitted over 800 messages during those 2 days. They coordinated naval gunfire, requested emergency medical evacuations, and directed artillery strikes onto Japanese pillboxes that were pinning down entire companies. None of the messages were decoded. None of the transmissions were compromised. None of the orders were delayed by a single second. Major Howard Connor, the signals officer for the division, later stated with absolute conviction, "Were it not for the Navajo, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Entire battles turned on the voices of these men carried through the static. While the Japanese military could see the Marines on the beach and hear the chatter on the airwaves, they were essentially blind and deaf to the Americans' true intentions. The Navajo code talkers had achieved the impossible. They had weaponized their culture to defend a country that, only decades earlier, had tried to erase it. On the slopes of Mount Suribachi,
The ancient sounds of the American Southwest became the primary tool for the liberation of the Pacific. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Navajo code talkers returned home to a country that still practiced segregation and denied them the right to vote in many states. But they carried a secret that made them some of the most important men on the planet.
The Marine Corps realized that the Navajo Code was so fundamentally unbreakable that it was a strategic asset of the highest order. They feared that if the story ever got out, the Soviet Union or other future adversaries would begin studying the Navajo language to prepare for the next conflict. As a result, the code talkers were given a final, solemn order: tell no one. They were forbidden from discussing their roles with journalists, with historians, or even with their own families. For 23 years, these men lived in quiet obscurity. They were ranchers, miners, and teachers who never mentioned that they had held the fate of the Pacific in their hands. The medals they deserved went unissued, and the history books remained silent about their contribution. When the transport ships finally pulled back into San Diego and San Francisco in 1945, the Navajo Marines walked down the gangplanks and into a world that had no idea who they were. They had survived the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima and the jungle rot of Guadalcanal. They had carried the most sensitive secrets of the Pacific theater in their minds, but as they stepped onto American soil, the curtain of government secrecy fell hard and fast. The Department of the Navy realized that they had stumbled upon something too valuable to let go. The Navajo Code hadn't just been good, it had been perfect. It was the only tactical code in modern history that had never been cracked. Fearing that a future conflict might require the same linguistic shield, the military classified the entire program at the highest level. The code talkers were called into small, windowless rooms and given a final, sobering order: silence. They were told they could not speak of their specific duties, not even to their parents, their wives, or their children. They were to tell the world they had been simple radio operators or clerks. No medals. There were no public ceremonies at the White House. No recognition. Their discharge papers remained vague, scrubbed of any mention of the specialized intelligence work they had performed. No stories. The incredible narratives of how they outsmarted the Imperial Japanese Army were locked away in steel filing cabinets in Washington. For decades, the code talkers lived as ghosts within their own communities. They returned to the reservation, to the sheep herding, and the quiet life of the high desert, carrying the weight of the war alone. A father would sit at the dinner table, his hands still shaking from the memory of the mortars at Okinawa, and when his son asked what he did in the war, the father could only look away and say, "I carried a radio." The most successful code in military history was effectively erased from public memory, a masterpiece of American intelligence hidden behind a wall of official secrecy. As the years passed and the world moved into the age of the computer, cryptographers began to analyze why the Navajo system had been so uniquely impenetrable. They realized that the strength of the code wasn't found in its secrecy alone. It wasn't just that the Japanese didn't have a dictionary. It was that the code was rooted in culture. You can reverse engineer a machine. You can steal the rotors of an Enigma machine or the wiring diagrams of a Purple machine. You can use mathematics to find the statistical probability of a letter's frequency, but you cannot reverse engineer a living language. The Navajo code relied on context and memory. It was a three-dimensional language where the meaning of a word was shaped by the inflection of the voice, the history of the tribe, and the specific landscape of the Navajo Nation. It couldn't be stolen. There were no code books to capture on the battlefield. The files existed only in the synapses of the men speaking. It couldn't be calculated. A computer can find patterns in numbers, but it cannot understand why a tortoise represents a tank unless it understands the humor and the observational spirit of the Navajo people. It required a lifetime.
You couldn't study Navajo to the level required for the code. You had to grow up inside it. You had to have the red dust of the four corners in your lungs and the stories of the holy people in your ears. The Japanese intelligence officers, for all their brilliance, were looking for a mathematical solution to a cultural fortress. No enemy ever broke the code because no enemy could simulate 20 years of Navajo life in a laboratory. The code was unbreakable because it was human. In 1968, 25 years after the war ended, the Pentagon finally lifted the veil. The Navajo Code Talkers program was declassified and the folders were opened. As historians and the public pored over the records, the staggering truth finally came to light. The Allies hadn't won the Pacific through sheer industrial might alone. They hadn't won just with the fire of the flamethrowers or the steel of the battleships. They won with memory, the ability of 29 men to memorize hundreds of complex terms and recall them under the pressure of incoming fire. Identity, the willingness of a people who had been persecuted by their own government to use their forbidden language to save that very government. A language the world had ignored, a tongue that had been dismissed as primitive by outsiders, became the most sophisticated weapon in the American arsenal. The secret intelligence files written in a language no one could decode weren't locked in safes or buried in the ground. They were spoken into microphones in the mud of the Pacific Islands. They were carried through the airwaves, through the static and the screams of combat, and they carried victory with them. The Navajo Code Talkers reminded the world that in the clash of great machines, the most powerful tool remains the human voice. They are a permanent testament to the fact that our greatest secrets aren't always found in our technology, but in our heritage, the stories and the languages we carry within us, waiting for the moment they are needed to save the world.